I'd like to, it's my very great pleasure to welcome and introduce Christopher Kremmer as our lecturer tonight. Christopher has an extraordinary reputation, a highly deserved one as a journalist and as a writer of narrative non-fiction of books set in the Asian region. Christopher is a contributor to the Sydney Morning Herald, used to be a staffer there. He's spent many years working his way around Asia, writing his way around Asia. His books include Stalking the Elephant Kings, The Carpet Wars, Bamboo Palace, and of course most recently Inhaling the Mahatma, which has been extremely well reviewed and has been favourably compared with the writings of V.S. Nepal, Bruce Chatwin and William Dalrymple. Christopher is going to be talking to us tonight on an absolutely irresistible and fascinating subject, the subject of greed. So I invite Christopher to come and deliver the first lecture for this year.
When I was invited to deliver the first of Sydney Penn's Voices 3 Writers Project lectures on greed, courage and survival, and was told that I would be speaking on greed, my initial reaction was, great, I bagged the fun subject. Pretty soon though, I began worrying about the organisers' choice. Why greed, and more importantly, why me? Did they perhaps think that I'm some kind of expert on the subject? Am I, horror of horrors, some kind of expert on the subject? On the one hand, I grasped the opportunity to spend time reflecting on one of the great subjects of our time and any time, and on the other, I experienced a sense of guilt and the fear that I might be perceived as greedy, the fear even that I might perceive myself as greedy. Greed is about the self, society, and the places where those things meet. There are two basic theories about it. One holds that greed is unacceptable, a violation of the social contract that binds any community. The other theory holds that greed is necessary, the thing that makes us active and productive members of society. Despite having been with us throughout our lives and been with our species throughout its history, greed remains, in a sense, mysterious. Tonight, I want to explore that mystery as it's played out in our history and culture and literature, and consider its powerful impact on our society today. Sonny Bill Williams, if you have access to this broadcast, do tune in. First, though, let's look at ourselves. Horace, the Roman satirist and poet in the early years of the Christian era, advised people to exercise moderation in acquiring wealth and possessions. If a man has enough, more wealth will prove, he said, a burden and a peril. Very sensible advice. But he doesn't help us to determine when enough is enough. Unable to predict the future, the wise person will seek to accumulate sufficient assets to provide for their needs and the needs of their dependents for both the present and the years ahead. Fair enough. But what are these needs and how do they differ from greed? Well, need is the desire we feel for things that we cannot live without. Food, water, shelter, some medicine sometimes. Human beings are born needy. Without mother's milk, for example, or similarly nourishing food in liquid form, the newborn baby cannot survive. Greed is the desire for things that we feel that we can live without, like, say, $1 billion, but somehow manage to convince ourselves that we need, often quite desperately. Take the hungry baby. Not knowing how to salve the gnawing in its stomach, he screams, attracting the attention of his mother, who feeds him. Now his stomach is full and his mind no longer preoccupied with urgent necessity. Physically content, baby begins to notice things. Interesting things that he doesn't exactly need, but which fascinate him terribly, especially if somebody else has them. We're born needy, but we quickly become greedy, and most of us stay that way well into adulthood. Horace was no killjoy. He celebrated life and letters and greedily devoted a great deal of time to both of them. But he always urged his audience to observe what he called the golden mean, a sensible balance between the accumulation of possessions and the enjoyment of them. To be truly human, we need more than food, water and shelter. We need company, for example, entertainment. We crave love. We need to work, or at least do something to keep those active minds of ours occupied and our bodies active. We like challenges. These things define what it is to be a happy and healthy human being. People denied them, such as prisoners in labour camps, usually die. As I try to show in one of my books, Bamboo Palace, about the re-education camps of Southeast Asia, only a few, the exceptionally determined and disciplined, survive. So we need a definition of greed that doesn't blind us to human nature and our need for things beyond material subsistence. Where do we find it? The appropriate level of greed for any individual is determined in two places. One exists in the physical self, the body. Eat and drink to an extreme, and your body is going to punish you. You may regurgitate what you have consumed or succumb to a more or less disabling state of obesity. The other place where greed is negotiated is in society. Plato and his pupil Aristotle use the word pleonexia to describe a corrupting, enslaving, demoralising and socially disruptive desire for more and more things. Importantly for this discussion, greed, by that definition, is not merely bad for the self, it's bad for society. Socially disruptive, the Greeks said. Society limits greed by determining what constitutes a fair share. And not just society, your parents, your partner, your friends, all have a say in deciding whether you are greedy. Greed is always a hot topic, a live issue, even between two people. Macbeth, the anti-hero of Shakespeare's play, is a winning warrior, handsomely rewarded by a just king. But Macbeth wants more. So he kills the king and seizes the throne of Scotland. But there's a problem. Macbeth lacks the political skills and presence of mind needed to run a complex kingdom. He's a good warrior, but a bad king, and his unsustainable greed brings about his downfall. Macbeth had everything he needed: wealth, social status, a fun job, but he and his lady suffered from what I would call dysfunctional greed. What mattered to them was not the reality of their circumstances, but the allure of their desires. Macbeth confused his wants and needs, was insufficiently self-aware about his own capacity, and unwisely proactive in the circumstances, and in the process destroyed what up until then had been an exemplary life. The moral of the story is that greed is not an abstract concept or a purely personal one. It has social consequences, and those consequences are determined socially. Greed is personal, but it is also inescapably political. In early human hunter-gatherer societies, the weak clustered around the strong male, whose physical strength and aggressive, possessive behaviour provided food and a kind of protection, the kind that requires you to obey the strong male. The enduring human concern with fairness has meant that greed is rarely welcomed, but often tolerated. Greedy people make things happen. They can enjoy great social esteem, even in the absence of using force, if their greed benefits the weaker, usually more numerous members of the tribe, clan, or nation. The cult of the provider acknowledges that the boss may be a mean bastard, but he's our mean bastard, and he shares the spoils of his many victories. If he doesn't, he can face a rebellion. The little guys might gang up and defeat the strong one. In this definition, the entrepreneur who creates jobs, the miner who produces export income, even the self-obsessed artist or scientist, never there for their friends or families, whose single-mindedness creates essential cultural product or cures cancer, all are examples of functional greed sanctioned to some degree or other by society. And perhaps the most popular providers are those who figure out a way to source the surplus they provide from outside the tribe. The consequences of their greed are borne not by their fellow tribe members, but by outsiders. Beginning in the early 16th century, the Age of Discovery enabled the European adventurers to plunder the wealth of America and Asia, which helped make European bourgeoisie relative to their foreign counterparts very rich. With the arrival of the Industrial Revolution, however, new ways became available to extract wealth from the workforce at home. Charles Dickens' novels show us the human face of that process. Children working in coal mines, urchins assembled in thieving packs directed by Fagins. Modern Australia was a nation created in part out of the horrors of that process. Amid the urban blight and unregulated exploitation of labour in the dark satanic mills of England, petty crime was the only means of survival for people like the fictional Thornhills in Kate Grenville's novel The Secret River, of whom she writes, "They were all thieves, any time they got the chance. The dainty parson could shrill all he liked about sin, but there could be no sin if thieving, if it meant a full belly." Not a sin, but definitely a crime, and convicts filled the prisons. But a solution was at hand in the guise of that particular form of greed that creates its surplus from outside the tribe, colonialism. By colonising Australia, the British could at a stroke dispose of their convict problem and simultaneously expand their empire. But having been expelled from home and missing it terribly, the convicts were soon amazed by the opportunities that existed in their new home. In order to consolidate the new colony, the authorities were actually giving away land. Land, that supreme commodity which for centuries had defined social status and economic power in England, here in Australia, was free. Greed could be satisfied by plundering that which belonged to others, simply by ignoring the fact that it belonged to them. And this privilege, bestowed cheaply on the early settlers, proved to be extremely costly to the original inhabitants. Free land, free water, a freewheeling attitude to the rights of others. Sounds like a free-for-all to me, an El Dorado, but not exactly a recipe for developing sturdy values. In the colony of New South Wales, the right connections could produce windfall gains, and this culture remains deeply entrenched in our state and local governments, for example, to this day. The culture of the planning exemption and the shortcut, the nod and the wink from the all-powerful and therefore easily corrupted bureaucrat. The shonky culture in which everybody is a mate. Many of the problems that we confront in Australia today are arguably the legacy of this view of the land and its people as mere resources to be endlessly plundered. Since the gold rushes, we've been ripping it out of the ground as fast as we could, turning agriculture into an industrial enterprise, producing tradable commodities, depleting the rivers of the Earth's driest continent, and in a century when carbon matters, becoming the largest emitters of greenhouse gases per capita in the world. Of course, much good has been done as well, many things achieved. But the question I would pose is whether, in the case of Australia, greed was actually necessary or functional. Had we chosen the path of cooperation and respect towards the Indigenous people of this land, we could very possibly have avoided many of the environmental and social problems that are today proving so costly. Australia is a greedy country. How do we know? Well, let's look at what Australians give to those less financially well off than themselves. A study published last year, commissioned by the Petrie Foundation, found that the average annual donation to charity by Australian donors in 04-05 was a paltry 1/3 of 1% of the donor's income. So, those of us who give very little on average. But if you average the total charitable donations across the entire working population, the amount given is statistically insignificant. Australians, I think helping the poor is someone else's business, probably the government's or philanthropists. Greed, of course, is relative, no respecter of national borders. Some countries are greedier than Australia, but not many. The OECD, which represents the wealthy nations, published a list of how much the top 22 countries gave in foreign aid in 2005. Australia ranked 19th in a field of 22 when it came to global generosity. What I found particularly galling was that the British, French and even the Irish gave double what we did per capita as a proportion of their national income. It is pleasing, encouraging to note that the new Rudd Labor government has made a very strong start in turning around the abysmal record of their predecessors in this regard. I think they increased foreign aid in their first budget by $500 million. But obviously, a lot more needs to be done if Australians are to avoid earning the label of the misers of the Western world. Consider the following scenario. 4 friends meet in a convivial atmosphere at the home of one of them. The host mixes a mean cocktail and the conversation is bubbly. Appetites are sharpened. They sit down to dinner. On a warming plate before them are 4 filet mignon. Everyone eats meat. Nobody is under medical advice to avoid certain foods. Invited to choose his steak, the guest of honour reaches across and takes 2 of the 4 fillets. A quarter of the population has just claimed half the community's resources. Either somebody will have to go hungry or the rest will have to make do with less. Now, if that happened at one of your dinner parties, you would recognise it immediately as dysfunctional, unsupportable, insufferable greed. But in other contexts, the concept becomes more abstract. When Alan Moss quit his job as chief executive of Macquarie Bank in May, he got a payout. It was around $80 million. To put that in context, if you take only the salary and performance component of that payout, a mere $25 million or so, it was 420 times the average New South Wales workers' pay packet of $59,000. It was also, interestingly, 73 times the Prime Minister's paltry annual pay of $336,000. These days, of course, Australians are less likely than they used to be to question such enormous inequality. But interestingly, Mr. Rudd felt the need to express his concern about Mr. Moss's payout. He said, and I quote, "I think at a time when a lot of Australians are pulling tight on their belt that it's important for our corporate leaders to do the same and show salary restraint." Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that Mr. Rudd's comments were inspired by envy. In fact, I do not believe they were. I think Instead, they go to the heart of the question of greed in modern Australia. For as long as I can remember, Australian corporates have been urging the community to exercise wage restraint in order that the economy remain competitive in the global market. But this same global market is also used to justify vast disparities in income between Australians. In his own defence, Mr. Moss pointed out that the world of finance is a globalised one, in which there is intense competition for the services of top CEOs. On the other hand, as he put it, those competing with people who are manufacturing in Shanghai or staffing call centres in India, they face the real possibility of their salaries being undercut by workers overseas. Well, I suppose the lesson you could draw from that is that if you're a developed country like Australia, globalisation is good for a small number of people with particular skills in high demand and bad for those working lower down the income scale in manufacturing and services. That's assuming we don't start doing things differently in Australia and haul ourselves up the value chain. The concept of Australians and Australia pulling together as a team is invoked to achieve wage restraint, but extreme inequality is put forward as the price of playing the world game. And when the Prime Minister of the country expresses the sensible view that, by setting a good example, limiting executive pay rises, corporate Australia would be more likely to achieve its goal of wage restraint generally, the appeal falls on deaf ears. What's been the result of Australia accepting this model? Well, in material terms, we have become more prosperous. The surveys show no happier, of course, but we have become more prosperous. But some, of course, have become much more prosperous than others. Researchers from the University of Oxford and the Australian National University have shown that in 1992, the salary of a typical executive of an Australian top 50 company was 27 times that of the average worker. 27 times. But 10 years later, in 2002, it was 98 times larger. In 2006, according to the World Wealth Report, 160,000